For those of you who are unfamiliar with film, film is a photographic medium that records images using light-sensitive chemicals instead of a digital sensor. Film works when photons hit the light-sensitive crystals on the film and cause a chemical change in the film that creates what's called a latent image. That latent image becomes an actual image when the film is developed in film processing chemicals. This video discusses Mako's Rollei Digibase Color Negative 200 film and looks at how to use it, the film's characteristics, technical details, and sample images. CN200 Digibase Color Negative 200 is the full name, is a medium-fast color negative film rated at 200 ISO and which is 24 DIN. It's an interesting film in that it lacks a red base like most color films have. So the film, when it comes back, has a clear base, and we'll see throughout this video what that does to the images. Digibase 200 is available in 35mm and 120. As of this video's recording, it's listed as unavailable, either discontinued or out of production for the time being. I'm not sure which. And it should be noted that during the time that I gathered photos for this video, twice CN200 was listed as being out of production. So it's entirely possible that it will come back into production in some way, shape, or form, and I hope that's the case, as the sample photos in this video should be demonstrating. For grain, Digibase Color Negative 200 has a medium heavy grain in 35mm and a medium grain in 120. In either case, the grain is heavier than most other 200 ISO color negative films. That said, the grain in this isn't unpleasant if your image aesthetic fits the Color Negative 200 images, and then the grain will complement your subjects well. As far as tonality and tonal range go, CN200 has a lower tonal range than most color films. It has a color palette skewed toward warm colors, and that's strange because the spectral sensitivity curve, which we'll examine in a bit, does not skew overly warm. In fact, on paper, this should be a very evenly toned film. I have wondered if the tonal range that the images in this video convey is due to the film having a clear base instead of a red base, but I couldn't find a definitive answer on whether or not that's the case. Acutance is also lower on CN200 than comparable 200 ISO color films. The transitions between tones is somewhat soft. This gives the film a very pleasing characteristic for portraits, however. Contrast with the film is okay to good. Contrast appears better than it really is because shadows and highlights tend to lose detail quickly compared to other C41 color negative films. The contrast across the film isn't flat, but it's flatter than other comparable films. When we see the characteristic curve, you'll be able to see that the gamma on this film is a relatively shallow angle, and that means that the film should, and I would argue does, exhibit lower contrast than 200 ISO films with a steeper gamma curve. The reduced tonal range that we talked about a moment ago serves to increase apparent contrast in the film's images because shadows and highlights tend to lose detail fairly quickly. Sharpness is a bit subpar compared to similar color negative films. Rollei's datasheet describes sharpness as good. I don't share that opinion. Now that said, Rollei's datasheet indicates that sharpness for this film is rated at 130 line pairs per millimeter, and that's very good. However, none of the images I got back appeared to resolve at that level. So to answer a key question here that most, if not all of you have, how did I test this film? In testing this film, I shot, it was either 25 or 30 rolls. I used 11 cameras. They included a Mamiya RB67, Bronica S2A, Nikon's FE2 and FM2, Pentax K1000, Minolta's Maxim 5 and 7, and some others. So it's not as though I have a small sample size to base my sharpness opinion on, nor have I just been using the same lenses and formats over and over. All told, approximately 35 lenses are represented in the sample photos seen in this video. That's a good volume of film, and it's a good number of cameras and lenses. It's not as though I just had one or two bad lenses that were slightly soft. Consistently, this film stock was a little bit softer than I would have liked. There is a good volume of detail images, but things like dog fur and bird feathers, for two examples, were not pin sharp in the images that I got back. With other films reviewed in this All About Film series, as you've seen, bird feathers and dog fur are pin sharp. But that's okay, because the subjects that I think benefit most greatly from this film stock's aesthetic also benefit from some softness. Dynamic range, also called gamma, on CN200 is a bit better than slide film, but worse than typical color negative film. If you've used this stock before, you'll know that it has a clear polyester film base instead of the typical red base found on color negative films. I suspect that contributes to the color tone, as I've said, and I suspect that and the specifics of the emulsion contribute to the lack of dynamic range. Now, apparently, CN200 can also be developed as slide film in E6, but I didn't try that for this review. There are some very good uses for CN200 and some that I would not recommend. The good uses include CN200 being a very good portrait film with flattering portrait tones. And portraits are, I think, the best use of this stock. It's also good for subjects that benefit from softer resolution, like some landscapes, pinhole camera images for sure, and other subjects where you don't need that technical precision and extreme intergrain contrast changes, the acutance as it's called. CN200 is not a good technical film for wildlife, architecture, or scientific uses. I didn't try CN200 at night. Given that this film loses detail and range very quickly when it's underexposed, I suspect that overnight photos would tend to be muddy and somewhat thin. For digital conversion, CN200 converts well into digital images. The grain in the film stock translates nicely when scanned or photographed, and the color palette is readily accessible to scanners and digital sensors. All right, so basically when we take a look at the color spectrum, what we're seeing in the spectral sensitivity curve is I've lined up the colors of the visible light spectrum with the curves. We see a film here that has a generally neutral palette, only very slightly biased toward warm tones. The yellow and orange peaks are slightly higher than the blue and purple peak. However, the cool tone peak is broader and encompasses a larger range of the cool end of the spectrum. The warm tones are more targeted. If you've wondered why so many of the images in this slideshow capture orange very well or have a good rendition of brown tones, these two warm tone peaks are why. To demonstrate this, here are the tones from the peaks of the spectral sensitivity curves according to my overlay of the color spectrum of the curves. I took the colors at each peak and will blend them together evenly. This is that result. Next, let's take the two warm tone peaks, that's these two colors, and we'll blend those colors evenly. Now, if we see the blend of, which is this result, it's pretty close to the film's strongest colors to my eye. To back that up, I picked out 5 photos of different subjects at random. All of these were taken in natural light, and I ran them through the Canva color palette generator. And here are the results from those. While the tones that Canva pulled from these 5 very different images don't exactly align with the 2 colors that we derived from blending the peak tones, they are in the same general range or color family. So basically, CN200 has a great ability to reproduce earthy tones, almost pea soup tones, in natural light. So taking a look at the characteristic curve, what we can see here is the film baseline, which is not provided in the technical data sheet. I took a rough guess at it. That's in blue. And then the fog line is, again, a rough guess. That fog line would be the baseline exposure. So some number of crystals are going to spontaneously expose with age, or just because it's a party and they want to do that. So if you were to take a roll of film, not run it through a camera and just develop it, that fog line is the density of the film that would come back. It would be basically empty, but there would be some number of exposed crystals. That's what the purple line represents. The inertia point is pretty far to the left. Now what that means is the inertia point is when the image starts to be recorded on the film. So it doesn't take a whole lot of exposure time for an image to start being recorded on CN200. The toe is where you really start to get something that could possibly be usable at some point. If your image is in the toe or even the low end of the straight line gamma, it's going to be really underexposed. Now, the straight line gamma represents the main body of the image and how much contrast and everything like that it's going to have. The steeper the gamma line, the more contrast the image will have. The shallower, the less contrast. With this, the datasheet did not say what the three different lines represent, so I'm reading this as the solid line is baseline performance for the film. The datasheet also did not indicate where the shoulder or the Dmax, the Dmax is density max, the maximum amount of density the film can have, the most when it has absorbed all the light that it can. The datasheet did not show that. So there's some incomplete data here, but what we can garner from this is that we have a generally lower contrast film that exposes quickly and has a relatively low amount of base fog. Mako provides no reciprocity information in the datasheet. That datasheet indicates that there is up to one stop of exposure correction, and my tests agree. CN200 is not a film with a lot of forgiveness. It handles more like a forgiving slide film than a standard color negative film, and that's because slide films are inherently unforgiving. Now, to that end, I suspect the reason that there's no reciprocity data is because slide films tend to color shift readily after a few minutes of extended exposure time. Depends on the specific slide film how long that takes. I suspect that CN200 color shifts relatively quickly in terms of long exposure times and compared to other color film stocks. So because there's no reciprocity data with this, it's a film that I would be hesitant to use for long exposures. Some of the pinhole images in here were long exposures. We're talking about 25 minutes, 15 to 25, 35 minutes. The colors were richer and had a little bit more of a magenta hue than typical, but this is not a stock that I would routinely use for long exposures. As noted just a moment ago, Mako's datasheet indicates that CN200 has a stop over and under of exposure latitude. For color films, that's not a whole lot. Again, as I noted, my experience backs this up. Now that said, none of my medium format photos, not a single one in this video, were captured using cameras that had light meters, and for none of those shoots did I have a light meter with me. So all of the settings for all of the medium format images were me eyeballing the light at the scene and taking my best guess at what the exposure should be. The film has enough latitude to cover for that. I can judge exposures pretty well, but I don't think I'm consistently within a fraction of a stop. So meterless shooting with CN200 is possible if you have the ability to gauge light levels to within a stop. Shoot CN200 at 200 ISO. This isn't a film that will in any way benefit from pushing and pulling. Also, develop it as C41. I saw some E6 samples from this and all of them exhibited very weird color shifts. If that's the look you want, go for it. But the CN200 color palette is very strong when it's developed in C41. For filters, a polarizing filter is a good idea. That would help darken skies and cut glare. No other filters will really give you any benefit with this film stock. As for format, I like 120 the most with CN200. I would probably shoot it in 35mm again, but I will almost definitely shoot it again in 120, assuming that it goes back on sale in the future. let's talk about the big issue with CN200, the major serious problem that I've hinted at but haven't discussed. Maybe it's the film's lack of a red base. Maybe it doesn't have a suitable protective layer on the back of it. But both the 120 and the 35mm stocks have massive upfront waste due to light leaks. In 35mm, this is what they look like. Most of my 35mm rolls have 5 to 7 frames up front with sprocket hole leaks. For 120 light leaks, this is what they look like. Most of my 120 rolls had 3 frames up front with red to magenta color shifts from, I assume, light leaking through the backing paper. The color shifting damage on the 120 rolls is so great that it's nearly impossible to rectify it on many images. The level of waste, which is up to 25% of each roll, means that CN200 is effectively 33% more expensive than the sticker price because you're only getting about 3/4 of each roll. I came up with that because 25% is 1/3 of 75%, and that's where the 33% more expensive comes from. I like CN200. It's possibly my favorite Color 200 film, though admittedly the competition there is not steep. I like the palette on it way more than Fuji. I like the image aesthetic a lot more than Kodak. That said, as I noted, it's listed as unavailable right now in every retail outlet that I checked, and that happened 2 other times while I captured photos for this video. My sincere hope is that CN200 comes back into production in the near future. I don't like the waste in the front of each roll, and I hope that if Rollei releases the stock again that they fix that. I really like the color palette on this film, and no other film I've used has a comparable color palette. CN200 fits a unique place in the films that have been available recently. It's a nice, muted, warm tone film that provides very flattering results on people, animals, and scenery. Losing Rollei Digibase Color Negative 200 for good would be unfortunate.